Really excited to introduce our next speaker, somebody who I have tremendous amount of respect for. We met originally through the self-storage asset class. He got his start as a project manager for a major construction company on the East Coast. Has been involved in almost every commercial asset that you can think of, has been involved in residential construction. He's done everything that there is to do in the construction realm. Now operates Whitney Development, his company that is an owner's rep. He comes in for developers and really helps them control costs, get access to multiple third parties, really understand how to go through each phase of the development process. So I'm going to stop speaking now and introduce somebody that I'm lucky enough to work with, but more lucky to call a close friend, Daniel Whitney.
Thank you, Thaddeus. I appreciate it. Um, yeah, I mean, Thaddeus just made me sound like a smart guy, but we'll see what happens, I guess. Um, so thank you, Thaddeus, for introducing me. That was great. Hello to everyone who joined. It looks like there's about 63 of you. Normally, I like to go through a call and say hi to everyone individually, as Thaddeus will tell you, but we're not going to do that here. Thaddeus wanted me to discuss the underwriting and designing of a budget for a new build and a value add, right? And it's a very broad topic, and with 20 minutes, we obviously can't cover anything or cover everything, right? So when you were getting into the underwriting, looking at a new project, what are the first things you need to look for, right? So with anything, you find a piece of land. Oh, this thing looks great. You bust out your calculator. You go on LoopNet or wherever you're pulling your rates from for the comps. You're saying, okay, cool. If I can charge this, I can do this kind of yield, yada yada yada. That's all well and good. That doesn't work, right? I think everyone on this thing is, if people are experienced real estate developers, they've seen deals that look great on paper, then you kind of dig into it more and you're like, oh crap, this thing doesn't work at all. Um, so one piece to look at first when you're looking at these things is obviously just, and one thing I tell everyone that I work with, all of my clients, is that, value engineering starts day one, right? Your construction costs, if you don't do this right from the get, they're shot. And the biggest component of this is going to be your construction costs. Obviously, I think we're all aware that sellers still to this day have unrealistic expectations of what their land is worth. Um, However, that's something we got to work around because that just is the market at this point. Um, so what's the first thing we got to look at? So, Thaddeus sends me over a new piece of land as he does 3 or 4 times a day at this point, right? Um, hey Dan, can we put flex on this? It's the same email 4 times a day. So we got to pull apart the zoning, right? Big thing is always the zoning. Can we get this thing through the city? What's going on, right? And a lot of guys will just pull up that initial ordinance section. Let's say it's in the business district and it says, hey, you're allowed to have warehousing, mini storage, whatever it is you're building, right? You're allowed to have this thing. Okay, great. That is not where it ends, right? Okay, now we need to look at what are my setbacks, what are my buildables, what are all these pieces, right? Because that's where a lot of projects go wrong. Am I going to trigger variances? Am I not going to trigger variances? So a big piece of advice I give to everybody, if they can do this or they have the ability, if not, you need to get with someone who can, is to build out a small site plan for what you want to put out there, right? Okay, this land is $2 million. In order to make this pencil, I need to do about 50,000 square feet, something like that. Okay, let's do that first. So plug in your setbacks, look through your ordinance, boom, you know what you can build on, right? Now you lay out some buildings. Okay. Now you got to lay out your parking space. Now you got to do all this stuff, right? These exercises don't take long periods of time, but these are things going to increase your underwriting power tremendously, right? So after you figure out if you can even fit anything on the site, right? Because a lot of times, I mean, I'm sure there's guys on here that have looked at a 5 acre parcel. Okay, this looks great based on a standard buildable. I can fit, 60,000 square feet out here. I can fit 3 parking spaces per space. I know I've got room for my stormwater management, so on and so forth, right? But then you look at your setbacks, you're like, well, hold on a second. From the front yard, this thing's sitting on a corner. I've got a 150-foot front yard setback. I've got a 50-foot rear yard setback, and I've got some wetlands possibly in the back, right? So now that my buildable area becomes an acre, so that project's out, right? So that's the first piece of it. Then as you're looking at the land, what is the land doing? There's not a lot of great land out there anymore. A lot of the good land has been taken. So a lot of land, every piece of land has its thing. right? We're working on a project currently where the sewer line is up above the piece of land, right? So we're gonna have to put in a pump station and get it out. You know, you need to look for those kinds of holes in it. Is there, you know, if you can get it, I mean, we have access to certain databases where we're pulling historic geotech on site, right? Because geotechnical issues are a big part where your site can go completely kaput. If you can't put in standard footings and foundations, you know, these things, with the rates you're getting for these things between 16 and $22 a foot, you can't really spend another $1 million, $2 million putting in ground improvements to hold up your buildings. So that's another piece you need to look at. Um, you know, you should always be looking at your GIS mapping, your wetlands, your, you know, riparian zones, things of that nature. You know, just a little piece of advice: if you see a creek that's 300 feet away, you need to ask about that. Even if it's nowhere near your site, you need to ask about that because that can trigger certain environmental requirements based on what that zone buffer needs to be. Um, so now you've gone through that stuff, right? Now it's time to kind of build out your construction budget. Um, you know, like I said, VE starts day one. So is that site plan that we put together the most efficient way of laying out the site? What is the best way of laying out this site? People who build this stuff all the time will tell you their building costs can stay relatively static, right? So you can have building costs like your metal for the building should remain relatively the same. Your HVAC cost should be relatively the same depending on your climate zone, things of that nature, right? Things that are going to affect your development are going to be in that site, right? What does my site work package look like? Am I going to have to do underground stormwater? Am I allowed to use PSS removal devices, or I have to use bioretention? If there is no room and you're building in an urban site, if I've got to do underground stormwater, I mean, a lot of underground stormwater, I'm sure guys are familiar with this, is that you have to use permeable pavement above a lot of underground stormwater systems just because um, I gotta exit this chat thing. This chat thing is distracting me on the right hand side of my screen. Sorry, guys. If you put in the permeable pavement, what does that do to an industrial style use? Right? You got high traffic coming through. You got trucks pulling in and out. How often are you gonna have to replace that permeable pavement and repave that? Right? So these are all questions that we need to answer prior to underwriting anything, because without that data, like you can go into an underwriting model and say, okay, cool, I'm getting $20 a foot. It cost me about X amount of dollars to build it. Okay, great. This thing pencils. Then you start spending money on architects, civil engineers, all these different things, land use attorneys. Get into it, start doing your due diligence. You're like, holy crap, this cost just got out of control. I just blew $20,000 for no reason. So these are a lot of the pieces that we need to pull together in order to properly underwrite a project, right? Then from the budgeting side of things, um, you know, a big piece of the budgeting is, hey, how are we putting these things together? You know, certain projects, just because, you know, maybe Brian Whitmer was speaking earlier, maybe they build everything they're doing out of metal, but maybe you're in Pennsylvania where you have you have a big per capita population of the Amish, right? And these guys are throwing out barns in like a day. So maybe we're doing wood truss framing. Maybe that makes more sense. What are my fire codes and how does that stuff play in? So, and also depending on the size of the facility you're doing, if you're doing over 150,000 square feet of this stuff, we're finding that precast concrete is actually working out for an exterior, right? For a building structure. Um, so all those different questions need to get answered in order to properly do that budget, right? And it all kind of comes down to that initial due diligence portion of your project. It's all that front end research, and it's this stuff. It sounds like a lot of stuff, but it really shouldn't take a lot of time. A big one that I've found with Flex Industrial is actually sanitary and sewer sizes out in the street, right? So you got to think about this. You're throwing up a 1 million square foot warehouse, you know, an Amazon warehouse, you might have 10 bathrooms in the place. That's easy to manage through like an 8 inch line. Something like this, you got 56,000, 70, 60,000 square feet. You might have 37 units. You've got 37 individual restrooms, right? So now we need to look at, you know, and a lot of this data, by the way, this is all available in most towns GIS mapping. You can pull this kind of stuff to see those sewer lateral sizes. Um, but you know, if you're adding 37 restrooms to an existing system, a lot of times that could trigger main extensions. It could trigger making the mains bigger. It could trigger putting a new main in. So these are the pieces that you kind of need to look at. Um, and I go into that, and it sounds like a lot of stuff, but you can't, that's where the VE starts day one, and you can't underwrite a project without knowing, you can't properly underwrite a project without knowing this information. Right. And I do feel like that we work with a lot of different people, whether it be, the one-off owner who owns one thing all the way through some of the largest institutions in the country, developing their real estate. What we've found is everyone kind of makes those few little simple mistakes. Is that they kind of say, okay, a guy like Thaddeus calls me and says, "Hey Dan, what am I building flex for in New Jersey?" It's like, I'm sure Mike Butcher speaking on this. I mean, Mike Butcher could probably speak to how many guys call him in a week and just say, "Hey, what am I building X for per square foot in New Jersey?" Right? And I'm sure Mike will tell you, it's like, well, what part of New Jersey? Where are you at? Right? All those different pieces kind of play into it. Um, I don't know what else you want me to do, Thaddeus. I mean, I speak quickly, guys. I apologize.
No, nothing to apologize for. I think you nailed some points, and Russell and I talk this all about this all the time. And I hope you guys on the call are recognizing how many little pieces when I send a plot of land come into figuring out whether I sent one to Dan a couple weeks ago. It had a bunch of existing impervious coverage. There was some concrete that had already been laid on the site. It was an old site. That wasn't being used anymore. The removal of that concrete was the difference between the site penciling and not penciling, right? The civil costs we were going to have to pay just to get rid of that existing impervious coverage, and it wasn't good enough to pave over and keep. So again, this is one of those areas, and give me a one in the chat if you've ever read Who Not How. But this is why I rely on people like Dan that have been there and done that. And Mike Butch, who's on the call also. So many great people in the industry that know the things that I don't know, right? I know what I'm good at. I'm good at connecting people. I'm good at talking to people. I'm good at getting information from people. I don't know how to look at a piece of land. And Dan, it's so great. He said it's easy. You can go get the information easily. Anyone in the chat, give me a thumbs up if you've ever tried to understand a zoning map and just gotten a headache, right? Give me a
Well,
thumbs up in the chat if you've ever looked at a zoning map and gotten a headache. And the thing is every single town zoning map is different, which is why I rely so strongly on people like Dan who does it every day. When he looks at a zoning map, it doesn't give him a headache. When he looks at a GIS map, he knows exactly what he's seeing. That's a language that he's fluent in. And why would I try and learn that language myself if I know somebody who's been there and done that and who's great at it and who I rely on?
and there's another thing too is zoning maps and zoning that a lot of people don't take into account. And I think that's actually an important thing. And thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's an important thing to talk about with looking at these sites, right? So a lot of zoning ordinances are extremely antiquated. If a lot of people on this call are looking at new sites and developing real estate, I'm sure you're running into these zoning codes that are written back in the 60s and the 70s that just aren't relevant anymore, right? Um, and a lot of towns, the way they're correcting that stuff is by putting in overlay districts. And overlay districts are places that people can get burned. Um,
You
overlay
just
dis
had to bring that up, didn't you? We
Well,
just
no,
we
it's
just
not, it's
got
not, it's not,
absolutely burned by an overlay district that was not
it's
recorded, by the way. You didn't know it was there.
no, it was not. No, that's the other problem, is that these overlay districts are not recorded. So, well, actually, that's a different conversation because they're supposed to record them. However, a lot of these places don't record their overlay districts, or they have town planners. And when you start hearing this overlay district stuff, oh, okay, maybe it has some superior architecture clauses in it. It has these different pieces, if you guys are familiar with that stuff, right? Where they'll say, okay, the facade facing the road has to have 70% of X kind of facade on it. You have to have this much of transparent surface, so on and so forth. Flex industrial is allowed, yeah, no problem, but 70% of it on the front needs to be glass and brick. It's never going to pencil, right? Another piece to look at when you're looking at land is what was the land's previous use, right? That's a big one. Is a lot of you see these pieces of land and you're like, oh, it's all wooded, it's all undeveloped, it's all good, right? Or oh, hey, it's old farmland, it's all great. Um, that's not necessarily the case. Old farmland is probably some of the worst land you can buy. If you guys are familiar with the process, so they grow crops, they grow, they harvest them, the rest of it dies off, and they keep doing this cycle. And as they do that cycle, layers of organics build up on the top of that site. So now you've got to look at that site while you're underwriting it and say, okay, cool. If I'm doing site work out here, before I do any site work on any of this, I've got to go cut the first foot of soil off this thing. And what am I doing with them? Am I trucking it off? Because there's somewhere on site where I can put it, right? So those are the pieces you need to look at in order to do this stuff effectively, right? You need to be able to look at it and say, okay, this was an old factory. Great. Okay, let's convert this old factory. Well, hold on a second. What did they produce? Right? Were these guys floating creosote soaked telephone poles all over the place? If so, the place could be an environmental disaster. And that's where the value add part comes in is, hey, look, I'm looking at an old warehouse. How can we take this old warehouse and turn it into flex industrial? Generally, those conversions can be extremely simple, right? They don't need to be overcomplicated. Um, but if you're looking at the stuff that's coming up in the market, like if you've got a site, the whole site is dock height. Now you're kind of at a disadvantage in that market because now you're at a dock height facility with 1,500 square foot or 2,000 square foot units, whereas the guy down the street has a beautiful 12 by 14 door that he can pull his truck into no problem. So that's a big piece of it, right? What was that thing producing? Were they producing computer processing chips, right? You might think that's a very benign use, very easy. Were they producing light bulbs? Like all these different things had chemicals that were involved that a lot of these companies were not properly disposing of, therefore creating environmental disasters, right? And maybe that just comes from me because I live in New Jersey. I mean, I don't think there's a clean site in this state. Um, but those are the pieces that you kind of have to look at in order to effectively underwrite these things. And before you underwrite anything, you should try to have at least 50 to 60% of this figured out. It's going to be hard to figure everything out. Um, but that's going to be the hard part because those are going to affect your hard costs drastically. Um, that kind of goes back to the geotech side. And then if you're in Texas, I mean, there was a guy here from Texas earlier. Your land use laws, that's the Wild West. Places like Plano and Richardson, Texas. I don't know how you guys do it. I've got a couple projects in Texas right now, and it's the ETJs over there are wild. But yeah, thanks. That's kind of, I guess I got
Tell us
20
about
minutes.
it.
Jeff, I don't know Jeff, I gotta tell you something. I'm going after the city of I was going after the city of Richardson on one thing. Plano lost their land use department. I've got the city of Burleson coming at me with an ETJ. It's just nuts.
Hit me
And
up.
they don't do anything to you until you're ready to pull building permits out of there. It's so stupid.
Yeah, hit me up. I know a ton of folks in Richardson, Plano.
Oh, we brought in like I told the guy I wanted to find like the law firm where everyone just shows up in like a black suit and black tie and like black cowboy hats. That's what I was looking for, and that's what we found. Um, okay, so yeah, so Thaddeus, that's kind of my piece. I guess I
Dan,
could take some
appreciate it
questions.
so much, man.